right, thanks. Hey, everyone. Hi. How's everyone feeling? It's a little early. We're feeling good? Awesome. So most of you or all of you probably know who I am. I've been with the center for, I think it's been over 6 years now. And when I was asked to present today, I tried to figure out what I wanted to share with you guys. And I often like to talk about suicide education and prevention. That's a really big one for me. That's very important. And I like to talk about stigma as well and combating that and breaking it down so that people feel like they're safe and they deserve to reach out for support. And then I thought about that support and what it ultimately leads to, which is recovery when we're talking about mental illness. And so that's what I wanted to focus on for today. So since we're a bit of a smaller group, if you guys have questions or comments, we can go with it throughout, make it a bit more of a discussion. We don't have to wait till the end, so just let me know if you ever want to ask anything. And I'm going to start by asking you guys a question. What comes to your mind when you think about recovery? What kind of concepts or emotions? What comes to mind when I say recovery?
Think of recovery from drug addiction.
Yeah.
Getting better, not drugs or drinking or whatever, an addiction.
That's a big one for sure, definitely. Change of lifestyle, yeah, that's definitely involved in the recovery for sure. That's a good one. Anyone else? Yeah.
A lifelong process.
Yes, I like that one. That's very true, and we'll talk about that quite a bit more as I go through the presentation. So as you can see from the image that I chose for this first slide, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, it's a little bit funny, but I think it's absolutely true. A lot of people think of recovery as a point A to point B kind of thing, but it's a journey, it's a process, and that's kind of what that expresses. And you can see that little squiggly, messed up line, and the fact that it's not always easy. But the point is that it's always worth it, and that's kind of what I want you guys to come away with from what I have to share today. So I like to say that recovery is not linear, nor is it something that you owe anyone but yourself. And that reminds me of something that my mom shared with me when I was younger, when she was sharing with me the fatal dangers of smoking cigarettes, which I'm sure all of our parents have shared with us. And she was a smoker before my brothers and I were born. And what she always shared with me was, everybody told me to quit smoking when I was thinking of getting pregnant. Do it for your kids, do it for your husband, do it for your health. And she did quit, of course, when she was pregnant with me. And then she picked it up again. And then she quit again when she was pregnant with my brothers, and then she picked it up again. And she told me it really only worked when I finally decided to do it for myself and for myself only. To do what's best for me and what's going to be best for my life, and just put myself as a priority. And that's when she was finally able to quit for good. So that's something that I think about when it comes to recovery, is that trying to do it for someone else isn't going to have that power and that meaning to you, and doing it for yourself and putting yourself as the priority is ultimately what's going to lead you to be successful in that. So the next thing I want to show you is a beautiful painting that was given to me by one of our own, Megan, and this was a birthday gift to me, and she painted this herself, and I think it's a beautiful illustration of that concept of recovery not being linear. And the flowers just sort of gives it hope, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. So I wanted to show you guys that because I think it's a great image to kind of show that there are ups and downs, but in the end you keep moving forward, and that's what's important. So when it comes to recovery, before I flip to the list that I do have up there, in terms of, somebody mentioned lifestyle changes, which is a huge one for sure. What do you guys think of when you think of tools that would help you along with the recovery? Yeah. Support, yeah, for sure. Different kinds of supports as well. Anyone else? Yep, definitely. Yep, that would be a good one. Anything else from anyone else? Yeah, definitely. That would help you with that lifestyle change and moving into kind of a new routine, something healthier for sure. So we mentioned supports already. That's a big one. And then I've put support from loved ones and professional support because they can be both very important, especially substance use disorders was mentioned before, which is a big one that you may need professional support with. And when it comes to recovery from mental illness, professional support can be extremely important as well. So if we are focusing on mental illness, medication would be a big one as well. If that's something that works for you, it may not work for everyone, but it can be a huge tool in recovery. Hospitalization as well may be part of it. And lifestyle changes was mentioned as well. And then all of that self-development and emotional work that you have to do yourself to process through that recovery and progress through it. And so these are some of the tools that you might be using. And what's important to remember is that they all kind of work in conjunction, and it's a matter of doing what works best for you and what is going to be the best fit for what you're struggling with. And then when it comes to the tools, there's also obstacles. I'm sure you guys, as we've talked about before, recovery not being linear, there's ups and downs, and you're going to have setbacks. And so there's obstacles that exist to that recovery, and that's what can make it a little bit more difficult. So before I flip to that again, do you guys have any ideas of what might hold you back when it comes to recovering, especially from a mental illness? Yep. Yep, definitely the environment that you're living in. Yep, that's a huge one. Anyone else? Lack of supports, yeah, definitely. Yep. Stigma, that's a huge one for sure, and we'll touch on that a little bit more as well. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, breaking out of those unhealthy habits, definitely. So what I've got on this list, we talked about a lack of support, and then when it comes to both people in your life and professional support, so lack of accessibility to those professional supports would be an obstacle for sure. Trauma can be an obstacle to recovery because that can hold us back if we're still greatly affected by it and not able to process it yet. And then somebody mentioned friends, so a triggering living environment, people that perhaps are not in the same habits that you want to be in, aren't living that healthy lifestyle. And then the last three that I have are the ones I'm going to touch on the most: hopelessness, and then shame and guilt. So stigma was mentioned, and that's where that comes from. That shame and that guilt combine to create stigma that stops you from reaching out for that support, reaching out for that help, and that hinders recovery, partially because we often feel like we don't deserve that recovery. We feel like we're not good enough, we're not deserving of that support, and we don't reach out for it because of that. So here's a little bit of math that I've put together to kind of explain the way that I see stigma. So we have shame, which comes from judgment and lack of compassion from other people. So that's a judgment that's put on us by the other people around us. And it makes us feel shame because we feel that we're being judged, we're not being respected, people are not respecting our choices, or the fact that it's not a choice in terms of mental illness. And then that continues into guilt, which is that internal judgment. So that's how we feel about ourselves, and we feel this guilt for, especially again if we're talking about mental illness, we feel this guilt for being the way that we are, having the disorder that we do. And there's often a feeling of, I should be able to do better. I could be better if I tried harder. And so you combine those, and that creates that stigma that prevents us from reaching out for help and prevents us from feeling like we deserve that help. So I put this quote up because I think it's very apropos for this conversation. It's from Brené Brown, and she says, if we share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. So that's what I'm hoping to do today, is to continue by sharing a little bit of my story of recovery. And I think that every time somebody does that, it helps us break down that stigma and that shame, because we're opening up a conversation to empathy, understanding, and respect, and creating a safe space for us to talk about what we've been through. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been through in terms of recovery, through the lens of recovery, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So I'm going to start by telling you that the last time that I tried to kill myself, I needed 14 stitches. And the time before that, I was in a coma for several days. And now you hear that and you may think, well, I wasn't getting treatment, I wasn't ready to get better yet, and there were things holding me back. But the truth is, I was receiving treatment, I was in my recovery, and I still had those steps backwards. And so that's important to remember, because people like to hear a simple story of, I was diagnosed, I sought treatment, I found treatment, I got better. And people who lack education and understanding on mental illness seem to have this misconception that it is this linear process where you get the help, you recover, and then you're better. But we don't cure mental illness. We certainly do heal from it, but there's no curing it. If you have clinical depression, if you have schizophrenia, there's no magic pill, there's no surgery, there's no curing that. That's something that you'll manage for the rest of your life. But you can heal from it and go through that recovery process and learn to manage it and live a healthier, happy, more fulfilled life. And so that's what I've had to learn how to do. And it started quite young. The first time that I spoke about wanting to die, I was about 10 years old. And my mother heard from a friend's mother who had overheard me, and she reached out to me and said, honey, do you want to talk to someone? And I'm 10 years old, I'm scared, I'm shy. I didn't think that I wanted to talk to anyone. I said no, and I just went on with my life. And I often wonder, if I had received the support that I needed at that time, where would I be now? But that's another thing about recovery, is that you can't be ashamed of what your process was and what your journey was, and you can't have any regrets, because that will just continue to hold you back with all of those what ifs. And it's important to focus on how far you have come and be proud of that. So I didn't get the support that I needed when I was younger, partially because I wasn't ready for it. I was too young to understand. And then I went on to live my elementary and high school years being a decently happy kid. I was struggling, but I managed to make friends. I managed to partake in activities that kind of helped keep me afloat. And there were other outlets for me as well. So I was writing a lot. And certainly if you had taken a look at my writing, it was clear that something was going on. I was writing a lot of angsty, angry songs, as I'm sure a lot of teenagers do, but there was a lot behind it. There was a lot of pain. There was a lot of emotion. And at this point, I still didn't know what was going on, and nobody had any idea really what the issue was. And so I moved into my university years, and I started realizing that I was really struggling. But I had, because of that stigma, because of the way that I was judging myself and the judgment placed on me by others, that stigma was telling me that it was my fault, that if I tried harder, I could be better. I didn't even know there were names for what I was experiencing. I just knew that I was having a hard time. I looked around me, I saw other people living their life without crumbling at every onset of emotion, and I thought, you know what, I'm just not trying hard enough. And that's when things got pretty bad. So I didn't have any of that professional support, and I had very little support from the people in my life, not through lack of want, just through lack of understanding. And because of that, I fell into unhealthy coping mechanisms. And at first, a lot of the people in my life, again, that misconception that recovery is just a simple 1 + 1 = 2 of finding treatment and getting better. There were a lot of people in my life, partially because they didn't want to see me in pain, and partially because it's very difficult for the families and loved ones of people with mental disorders as well. That can be very hard on them. So because of both of those factors, there were quite a few people hoping that that's what it would be. All right, she'll get treatment, she'll get better, and that'll be it. It'll be done. She won't have bipolar anymore. She won't have borderline personality disorder anymore. But as time went on, I realized that that's something that I would have to manage for the rest of my life. But treatment is something that could help me manage it better and help me on that process of recovery, which, again, the end goal is not to be cured and to no longer have that disorder, because that's not possible. It's to learn how to manage it better, how to have a healthier and more fulfilled life while living with that disorder. So I began treatment with this doctor, and we started working on all the behaviors and the symptoms that were making my life more difficult. And things were hard. Things were hard, I'm not going to lie. They often are, and it was a process. It was a journey of learning, being more self-aware, learning about myself. And I learned through that what I could do to manage the symptoms that I had, and what I could do to feel healthier and to feel happier despite the fact that I had these disorders. But there are always, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are always steps backwards. And that doesn't mean that you stop moving forward and that you're not able to progress, but you will have hiccups. And there are definitely quite a few of those. I can't remember the number of times that I would count the days since I hadn't self-harmed, and then I would fall, and I would do it again and think, you know what, I've just ruined my streak. I may as well just give up entirely. But I had to pick myself up and remind myself, as was mentioned before, substance use disorders is something we think of often when we think of recovery. And it's very similar with an addiction, where you want to go all of that time without giving into that addiction, and then you might stumble and do that, and you feel like you've ruined everything and you have to start from zero again. And so that can be incredibly discouraging, and I definitely went through a lot of that. But with treatment, I was able to keep going. And I was living at the time in an unhealthy relationship. So my recovery was hindered by that. That's something that we looked at in terms of obstacles, that living environment or the people in your life that perhaps aren't as good of a support. And this relationship was definitely toxic. The partner that I had was unhealthy at communicating himself, which made my unhealthy communication style, that combined just was a whole mess. And we had a huge fight one night. We had a breakup, and I had my first suicide attempt. And a lot of people were shocked. I thought she was getting treatment. I thought she was getting better. But those are the hiccups and the fallbacks and the steps backwards that you have. And what's important to remember is that there is a way to pick yourself back up and keep going. And that's what I had to do, despite the fact that it seemed like a huge setback at the time. I thought maybe, you know what, I'm not cut out for this recovery thing. I'll never get better. But I had to pick myself up again and try to reframe and make a new plan. So at that time, with this relationship and this partner, I was living in Montreal, which is where I'm from. And I had that suicide attempt. I remember thinking, simultaneously, don't do this, you're setting yourself back, and I need to make the pain end. I don't know what else to do right now. And so after that breakup, I took every pill in the apartment, and I just knew that I wanted the feelings to stop. I just had had enough of living with these disorders, of having these emotions, and all of this psychological pain, and I just wanted it to end. But there was a part of me, like I said, that was thinking, we're on the right track here. You're getting help, you're getting support. There must be a way to get better. Why would you do this right now? And I called a friend. And I didn't tell her what happened, but I just said, we broke up, I need to come over. I need support right now. So I got in a taxi, and when he dropped me off at her apartment, I called her and I said, I can't pay, I can't get out of the car. And she thought something was a little bit weird about that. So she came out, she paid the cab, and she quickly realized that I wasn't okay. And she called an ambulance. And so I ended up being hospitalized. And while I was in the hospital, I was communicating with my psychologist at the time, the one that I'd begun treatment with, and my friend was communicating with my mother. And the psychologist that I was getting treatment from, she is absolutely amazing, and she specializes in borderline personality disorder, which was incredibly helpful. And so she had a good idea and a good handle of what I was struggling with and what I was dealing with. And she was both surprised and not surprised that I had had a suicide attempt. She knew that I was struggling, and she understood that there were suicidal thoughts that were chronic, that were very difficult for me to combat. But she also knew how much strength I had, better than I knew at the time. She knew that better than I did, that I had that strength and that potential to go through that recovery process and manage things a lot better. So she understood why it happened, but she was also surprised because she could see that potential and that strength that I had that I wasn't even able to see yet. And so when I left the hospital, I discussed with her and we talked with my mother, and we came up with a new plan, which was to move me to Durham region. And so I moved here, moved in with my mother because I needed that support, and I'm grateful to her for that. She has done so much for me. And we decided that I would find a therapist in Durham region, find a psychiatrist in Durham region, find some activities to get involved in, potentially a job, and just start that recovery process again. I fell down, I had to pick myself back up and start again. And that can be really discouraging. And that's, like I talked about before, when you break that streak, especially with something like an addiction, or like I was dealing with something like self-harm, when you don't do it for quite a while, and then you break that streak, you feel like you're starting from scratch. And that's kind of how I felt when I moved here. But it actually ended up being a life-changing move, and there's a lot of good that came from it. So I ended up in Durham region. I started treatment again. And things were difficult, but I was finally on the right track. It felt like things were getting better, things were getting easier. And then I fell into another relationship, and this one was just as toxic. I know, I should have learned my lesson, but I didn't. And that's because with borderline personality disorder, part of the symptoms are interpersonal, and it comes from an ineffective and unhealthy way of connecting with other people, and that's partially based on identity issues. And so it comes with stress, sense of identity, and giving yourself and your life meaning. And oftentimes people with BPD will connect that to someone else. So I was using a relationship to fill that void, to feel like I had an identity and feel like I had purpose and meaning. And that's why these relationships, even if the had been healthier communicators or just mentally healthier themselves, it was still doomed to fail because I was in that place where I was not seeing myself as a whole person, and I was using that relationship to sort of fill the gaps and fill the holes, which, as we all know, is definitely unhealthy. And so I fell into another relationship, and that hindered my recovery again. It was extremely difficult, and the same thing happened again. There was a breakup, and there was a suicide attempt. And if I backtrack a little bit, before things got to that point, as I started getting better, I ended up starting one of the most life-changing things that I've ever done, which is join the Distress Center Durham. And I did a quick Google search of distress centers and helplines that were potentially looking for volunteers, because I knew that I wanted to help provide a service that I wish I knew existed, that night when I took all those pills and I knew that I wish I'd known there were numbers I could call to be on the other end providing the service on that number. And so because I was Googling from Durham region, Durham came up and I contacted the center. And at first I was really apprehensive. I thought, who would want me as a volunteer who is struggling with all these issues? Who am I suited to help really? How am I going to help anyone? And I quickly realized how open and welcoming DCD is, and how the main goal is just to find volunteers that have it in their heart to help people and that want to give that support. And so all that it required was a letter from my therapist stating that I was in a mentally good place to be able to do this work, which she was able to do for me because I'd been getting quite a bit better. And so I started volunteering. And as things progressively got worse again, I found that in my work at the center, I was able to put all of that aside. It gave me a time when I could focus on somebody else's recovery and somebody else's feelings, and kind of took me away from what I was struggling with. And I think that's how I managed to do good work on the helplines that long, as I was starting to struggle more and more myself. But eventually, it just all caught up to me and I couldn't do it anymore. And as I mentioned before, there was another suicide attempt, and time was much, much worse. I took all the pills in the house again, half a bottle of rye, and I actually had a seizure and my heart stopped. And I look back on that moment, and I shouldn't be here. By any logical sense of what happened, I should not be here right now. For some reason, my mom just happened to be visiting my house that day with my aunt, and she saw me through the front door. She had knocked on the door, and I had managed to come to the front door, and that's when I had the seizure. And she saw me through the door and broke in through the back door and called an ambulance. And so she and those paramedics saved my life. And when I woke up in the hospital, I realized it was several days later. And I just remember, the first thing I remember is a blob of green. My stepdad was wearing a green shirt, and then I realized who was in the green, and I thought, wow, he's actually here. And I'm going to start tearing up right now because it made me realize, I'm sorry guys. Wow, sometimes I forget that this is actually my life story, and that I feel it as I tell it. It's just a story that I tell so often in the hopes of breaking down that stigma, and sometimes I forget that it's me, it's my life. And when I saw that blob of green, I realized that he was there despite everything that I'd done to myself, despite the fact that it was a choice that I had made in that moment. Thank you. He was still there for me, and my mom was there as well. And I realized, you know what, there must be a reason that I'm still here. And I was scared. I wasn't sure if I would have suicidal thoughts again. I wasn't sure what would happen in terms of my recovery, but I knew in that moment that I was really grateful. And it sort of gave me a chance to refocus and look back on what perhaps had not worked as well. And I moved back in with my mom, and or we moved all my stuff back to my mom's, and I remained in the hospital for a while. And I was in the psychiatric unit at that time for much longer. And the plan was to release me when we had a better idea of how to keep me safe. Because at that point, it was the third attempt, and I was trying to be honest with myself, which is so important in recovery, that self-awareness. And I realized, I don't know if I can be safe right now. And my mother realized, I don't have the tools to keep her safe. She just wasn't equipped to deal with that kind of struggle, that kind of disorder. She just didn't have the tools to cope with it and to help keep me safe, so I stayed in the hospital. And eventually what we realized is that inpatient would be the best option for me. So we found a private treatment center in Boston that specializes in borderline personality disorder. And so I moved to Boston. And I was there for 5 months. And there was the most structured part of my recovery, and the part that gave me the most skills and tools that I still use today that keep me on the path that I'm on. And so finally we had a step that was extremely concrete, extremely structured, and very specific for me to get better. And so I'll paint you a bit of a picture of what my days looked like in this center. So we would have groups in the morning. So there were different groups. My personal favorite one was psychoeducation, where we actually read medical literature about the disorder that we had and looked at brain scans and looked at all the science, which gave me this feeling of there is something different about my brain. This is not my fault. This is not a flaw in character. This is not something that I'm doing wrong. There's something medically different about me. And so that group was my personal favorite because it gave me that sense of empowerment of it's not my fault, but I have the power to change it if I want to. And we had other groups like interpersonal group, which for BPD, as I mentioned, is extremely important because a lot of the symptoms are interpersonal. So we learned how to communicate more effectively, how to handle conflict, how to resolve issues, that kind of thing. We also had a group that I absolutely hated, mindfulness group. I'm sure, who's heard that term before? It's becoming more and more popular, and it's absolutely a great tool for managing mental illness, for recovery. It's helpful for really anything, managing stress, but I am not someone who sits still easily, and my mind doesn't either. So mindfulness group was just the bane of my existence, which when I look back on it just means that I needed it all that much more. And so that one was an interesting one, and it taught me to be patient with myself, and it taught me to really reflect and try to process and ride the wave of emotions as opposed to shutting them out or shutting them down and trying to just move on right away, which is huge in recovery as well, because if you don't process what you're going through, there's no way to move on from it. And so those were the groups in the mornings. And then in the afternoon, we had one-on-one therapy. So we had a meeting either with our main therapist or with the psychiatrist that managed our medication or with a family therapist, and we would get our families on the phone and get them involved. Because as we mentioned before, support from loved ones and making sure that they understand is a huge part of recovery as well. And then other than that, we had activities. I mean, it was basically a house. I was living in a house with 10 other women also dealing with borderline personality disorder, which sounds like a really twisted reality show, which it kind of was. It definitely got interesting. We're all struggling with interpersonal issues, with high emotions, and we're all living together. So I'm sure you can imagine that cooking dinner one night or making sure the dishes get done, that could turn into a huge drama. But in the end, that was always a learning opportunity, and that's part of how we got better. And so I learned how to manage my recovery alongside these women who were doing the same, and we learned a lot from each other. And that's another thing about recovery and why I think that there's so much power in what I have to share is because I've lived it, and hopefully that is what connects with people that are living it as well. And so professional support is extremely important, but I think that peer support is a huge part of that recovery. And talking to people who've been through it and sharing experiences where you've lived through the same thing and you can learn from each other is hugely important. So I was there for about 5 months, and then I came home. I came home and I went back to the therapist that I'd found in Durham region, and we started making a new plan on how to continue to work on all those coping skills and those coping mechanisms and those tools outside of the treatment center. And so I slowly kind of pieced my life back together with that newfound understanding that a relationship perhaps wasn't the best thing for me to get into at that moment. And I mean, I'm sure you can guess what I did. I got into another relationship. So that was a huge opportunity because I now had all of these tools. I had done so much learning and growing, and I was really ready to make that recovery stick and to really try to avoid those stumbles and those steps backwards, which is entirely impossible, but trying to avoid them as best as I can. And so this relationship was an opportunity to realize where my behaviors were that were unhealthy in the relationship, but also what I was allowing from a partner that was unhealthy as well. And so this one lasted about 6 months, and for the first time since it probably had been about 8 or 10 years, I'm the one who ended it. And that's the thing with all of those suicide attempts. It was the other person ending it and me losing all purpose in life, all meaning to my life, and having a suicide attempt. And in this moment, I'm the one who said, you know what, this isn't serving me, it's not healthy, you're not the person for me because I'm not having my needs met and I'm not in a place where I can meet your needs. I can't do this anymore. And that was a huge learning experience because I realized that it kind of empowered me. I realized that I had the power to not only speak to what I need and set those boundaries with other people, but also be aware of what I'm capable of and put myself in a situation where I can be the most successful based on what I'm capable of at the time. And so after I ended that relationship, my recovery really picked up a lot more momentum, and part of that was returning to the Distress Center Durham. And after 3 suicide attempts and 5 months of inpatient, my thought was, they will never want me back there. That girl is crazy, do not put her on the phones. But I was welcomed back with open arms. Again, you know, under the stipulation that I had documentation from a doctor that I was in a healthy place to do the work. But it meant so much to me to be welcomed back. I remember before I left for the inpatient center, being in the hospital, and Angela came to see me, which meant so much to me. And I just knew that the center was a place where I'd found family and people that would really support me. And that's why going back there was really important to me. And that kind of started me on the path that I'm on now. So being at the center made me realize that that recovery that I was going through, there was a lot of power there and there was a lot to share. And it actually made me realize that mental health is what I want to do for a career. That's what I want to do with my life. So I started getting more and more involved and doing as much as I possibly could. And that's why I was so grateful when I was asked to speak today, because I think that sharing that story, like I said, there's so much power when you lived it. And a huge obstacle, as we talked about, to recovery is stigma. And the thing with stigma is that the best way to kill it is just to talk, to have open, candid conversations about mental illness. And that leads people to being understanding and to being more educated on those topics. And the thing with stigma is that sometimes we don't even realize that it's there. It can be really insidious. It just sort of builds gradually, and then next thing you know, it's these harmful, judgmental views that we have on certain disorders, on certain people. And if anybody in this room deals with any mental health concerns, I'm sure you've heard it from people who may not even have meant to hurt you, but have made a comment that made you feel like you're being judged. And the more that we talk about it, the more that we can combat that. And so that's what I was hoping to do by sharing my story, sharing my recovery, and having the Distress Center Durham be a part of that journey, as I could help people with what I'd been feeling. And on the helplines, I very rarely disclose everything that I've been through or my diagnoses. But I think that what I'm able to bring to it is that when somebody's going through something and I empathize with them, they can hear it, that I mean that, and that I really have felt it, and that I'm feeling it with them. And I think that's what brings power to the work that the center gives me the opportunity to do. And so what I think is important to remember about that is that recovery is extremely powerful for yourself, but it also gives you the opportunity for it to be powerful for other people. And that's why I keep sharing my story. So I actually volunteer with an organization called TAMI, Talking About Mental Illness. And we go to high schools throughout Durham region, and there's several of us speakers who share our personal stories. And I always tell the kids when I begin my talk, I wish I could tell you a simple story of being diagnosed, finding treatment, and getting better, but that's not what it is. And I explain to them exactly what I'm sharing with you today, which is that recovery is not linear. And it's so important to remember that what's powerful about it is that it's only up to you when you stop. If you don't want to stop, there is no end to recovery. You can keep progressing, you can keep moving forward, and what's important is that you're proud of that and never ashamed of those step backwards that you have. And that's the thing, as I've mentioned before with mental illness, is that you don't cure it. Somebody with schizophrenia will never take a magic pill and no longer have schizophrenia. I will never no longer have borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder. But as I said, I can learn to manage it. I can manage it better, I can be healthier, I can be happier, I can have healthier, happier relationships, I can connect with people better. And that's the thing with recovery, is that it never ends, and you can keep going towards those goals and keep moving forward despite the stumbles that you have. So I've got a few photos up here that I wanted to share with you guys. The very first one up there was shared on social media, and it was extremely difficult for me to do, which is interesting because I share a lot of my mental health advocacy on social media. I speak a lot in general about what I struggle with. I share my experiences in the hopes that other people can see themselves in that and feel less alone and be encouraged to talk about it themselves. But for some reason, those self-harm scars, that felt like just taking all of my clothes off and standing up in front of an audience. It was terrifying. And the comments that I received in that post were from so many people who'd experienced the same thing and said, wow, I can't believe you just showed us all that. You're making me feel like I can wear short sleeves in the summer and that's okay, and there's no shame in that. I can know that these are battle scars from things that I've had to fight inside myself, and there's no shame in that. And so it was extremely difficult to share, but in the end, it came back to me tenfold, the support that I had given people. I received it back from everybody who saw this photo and commented on it and came to talk to me about it. There is so much stigma around taking medication. If you're on psych meds, you must be crazy. You must be unstable. And I shared that one as well in the hopes of showing people that, again, there is no shame in that, and we need to combat that stigma. If medication is something that helps keep you stable, which in the case of something like bipolar disorder that I deal with, part of that is literally an imbalance in your brain. So medication can be incredibly helpful with that. And again, it's not for everyone, and there's no shame if you manage your illness without medication as well. That's completely okay. But I wanted to show that this medication did not make me crazy, did not make me unstable. It didn't mean that I couldn't do something like the work that I do on the helpline. It's just a tool that I have in my recovery. And then this photo at the bottom left, again, shared on social media in the interest of being completely transparent about what recovery looks like. So this was about a year and a half ago, and that's a bracelet from Lakeridge Hospital when I checked myself in. And it was a bit of a process of talking myself into going to the hospital at that moment. But in the end, it made me realize that there's a lot of power in that self-awareness and knowing when you need to reach out for more support. And I shared it in the hopes of showing people that it's never a weakness to ask for help. It actually shows quite a bit of strength. And I was able to find that strength within myself to march myself to the hospital and say, I need more support. I'm not okay right now. And I'm incredibly grateful. Lakeridge is the hospital where I ended up after the last 2 of my suicide attempts, and the nurses know me. The psych nurses are incredible. The psychiatrist who treated me while I was there is now my ongoing psychiatrist who follows me, and she's incredible as well. So there was a little bit of an element of comfort in going to that hospital, knowing that they knew me there, but it was still really difficult to make that choice. And in the end, I took this photo in a moment where I was like, I am damn proud of myself right now. Because 3 years ago, I never would have had that self-awareness and that strength to say, I'm going to take myself into the hospital because I'm struggling. I probably just would have fallen into a bad coping habit again. And then the one at the bottom right are patches and stickers for a charity called Submit the Stigma. Now, that's a charity that I help manage. I do all the social media and I help manage the events as well. It is within the jiu-jitsu community, which is the sport that I compete in. And I got involved because I was at a tournament competing, and an old teammate from a team that I had been on in the past came up to me and asked me how I was doing. And in that moment, I said, you know what? I'm not going to put on that facade and do the socially acceptable thing of, oh, I'm fine, how are you? And I said, you know what? I'm not okay. It's been really hard. And I knew that I could trust her with sharing that information, and I knew that she'd be open to it. And so she asked me, what's going on? And I told her that things had been difficult, that my mental illness had ramped up, and that it had been hard to manage, and that I was really struggling. And what she shared with me was essentially, she said, have you seen this girl who holds up signs? And I was like, what are you talking about? And there was a girl who had been competing as well. When she got on the podium, she would hold a sign that said #submit the stigma. And so she started this hashtag as a movement because a submission is a way to win a match in our sport. And so she called it Submit the Stigma in the hopes of sharing that message that we need to dismantle and get rid of that stigma. And so her hashtag grew into a movement, and the movement grew into a registered charity. And I contacted her and I said, hey, I have a friend who told me, have you seen the girl who holds up signs? And you seem to be the girl who holds up signs, so let's talk about it. And I looked back on this email thread, and it was 20, 30 emails deep of us just chatting back and forth, sharing our experiences. She has generalized anxiety disorder. Her father killed himself about, I believe it's 4 years ago now. And every year at the Suicide Awareness Walk for DCD, I put his name on the memorial wall in her honor. And she's taken that tragedy and used the strength that she's found from it to start this charity. And so we connected on so many levels in terms of mental illness and recovery that I got involved. And that's why I put that up there, because that was a huge part of my recovery as well, was getting involved in more movements, more organizations where I could be part of breaking down that stigma and use my story to help people feel less alone. And so my biggest contribution to this charity was starting the Instagram account, which again, the trend of social media here. It's just such a powerful tool for sharing ideas and sharing stories. And it gives people a certain level of comfort in terms of sharing and being open, because you're behind that screen. It's a little less vulnerable. And so I started an Instagram account for it where I solely share people's personal stories of mental illness and recovery. And so people submit their stories into me via email, and I post them on the account. And the very first story that I posted was mine. And that was a little bit scary as well. And then I looked at my phone one morning and I was like, 300 likes and 142 comments. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, comments, do I even want to look at those? And I started reading them, and they were all from people saying, thank you so much for saying this. I feel the same way, and I feel so much less alone that somebody else is going through this. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your strength. And that makes me a little uncomfortable because I don't think of myself as a strong, courageous person. I look at all these fallbacks I've had, these stumbles, 3 suicide attempts, and I think, where's the strength and the courage in that? But I'm learning to be more comfortable with the fact that it does take courage to do that, and I've been able to inspire other people to do the same thing. And so that's why that charity is extremely important to me. It's really helped me use my story to help other people, and that's given a lot of momentum to my recovery as well. So one thing that I mentioned a lot is that self-awareness, and especially when it comes to that anecdote of taking myself to the hospital. Self-awareness is extremely important because one thing that I talk a lot about in terms of recovery, and I talk about it in terms of self-care as well, is accountability. Now, self-care, who thinks, I mean, I'm sure everybody's heard that term, who thinks that that term is overused and they've heard it a little too much, or maybe it's losing a little bit of meaning because everything becomes self-care nowadays. Treat yourself, buy the thing, eat the thing, drink the thing. Everything is self-care, which in a way is not wrong. Self-care is taking care of yourself and doing what's right for you so that you feel good and healthy, and sometimes that absolutely is treating yourself. It's so important. But another aspect of self-care to me is that accountability and doing that personal work to work on the symptoms and the behaviors, especially if we're talking about mental illness, that are holding you back. There is no shame or blame in having a mental illness. It is never your fault. However, it is your responsibility to go through that recovery process and deal with the behaviors that affect you and the people around you, and to have the self-awareness to make those changes. Nobody can heal you and do that recovery for you. It's work that you have to do yourself. So it can seem a little bit unfair. So you're telling me this mental illness isn't my fault, but you're telling me it still falls on me to make it better. Well, unfortunately, that's how it goes because it affects us so deeply and personally that nobody else can do that work for us. But it's so important to take away that judgment of you're responsible for getting better because you did this. You're responsible for getting better because you're the one who knows yourself best. But it's absolutely not your fault that you have a mental illness. So when it comes to self-awareness, there's a few points that I like to bring up of things that I've learned through my recovery. And the first is knowing when to use our tools and our skills to cope. And that was a huge thing that I learned at that inpatient center. I learned the skills themselves, and then I learned when to use them.